Hello, I'm Dr. George Lee Moore, and this is an introduction to Nietzsche. I'm going to approach it by explaining first the will to power and its relationship or relation to ressentiment. Nietzsche used the French word deliberately, which I'll explain momentarily. So, what is the will to power? The will to power, let's consider will first. And this is my not quite patented cone of the psyche. Suppose that the will begins in the unconscious. I call it the incept flame of novelty, the very first. And I would like to also demystify the term ontology. What we're doing right now is ontology, which means the logos or account of the essence or of the first. That's not the only way to explain ontology, but because it is about the first, what is most essential and how do we account for it? And every philosopher has an epistemology or theory of perception and an account of this first. So if we go to, and I wrote, this is kind of like retrospectively existentialist, influenced by Martin Heidegger and Jean-Paul Sartre, that nothing is at the origin of our own consciousness, in our unconscious. So the will is all of our intentionality. And I also added poiesis, which is a Greek term for making or creativity in all of life, not simply verse. Poiesis or making as our intentionality. Let me demystify this term. It shouldn't, ontological or ontology, the logos of the essence, or intentionality is everything that we pay attention to, that we're willing to pay attention to, and also things that we repress, we don't want to pay attention to. So let's roll back to the most immediate influence on Nietzsche's will to power, Arthur Schopenhauer. There's an essay that I used to teach in my freshman classes, two of them. One was by Virginia Woolf, and it was called The Death of a Moth. And she goes to a windowsill, and she sees one of these moths that, I don't know what, have just a 2-week lifespan anyway, and it's struggling to stay alive. And she's saying, why? What is that? What's driving that? And another essay I used to teach is by Thoreau, and it's called The Battle of the Ants. And he gets down on his hands and knees and watches a battle between two ant armies, and their exoskeletons or thorax or antenna or whatever are being torn off. And he's saying, what is driving those ants? What is driving the moth? What is that? And that's what Schopenhauer called the will to live, which is kind of a biological analog for all of life itself. But Schopenhauer, who was an atheist, didn't think there was an afterlife. So the will to live in Schopenhauer is absurd. That is, it has no meaning whatsoever. So that will to live, that Schopenhauer is a pessimist in a formal way, in terms of his epistemology or theory of perception, in that the will to live, that striving, relentless, unconscious, all of life has it, is meaningless in the sense that because we die. So he is formally a pessimist. Nietzsche discovered Schopenhauer and then wrote The Birth of Tragedy. We'll get to that soon, and used the will to live in The Birth of Tragedy, but soon moved to the will to power. And what he did is that instead of life in a sense is not a geriatric endurance run, it's how you live and what you perceive. And he gave up pessimism, Schopenhauer's pessimism, when he moved the will to live and changed it to the will to power. Okay, what is power? Suppose that we make an analogy between the Chinese concept of qi, or let's say the Hindu idea of prana, energy. It's really a plenum of energy. And this is where Nietzsche is a little bit mean or merciless. He's saying that some people have more power. They have more, let's call it radiance, energy than others. And if this power is coextensive, this radiance is coextensive with life itself, some people have it naturally, and then you can accentuate it and nurture it and express it. But most people are deficient in the energy, or they repress it or oppose it, and we'll make a transition soon to nihilism or nihilism. So Nietzsche maintains that, suppose you were at a party in Brooklyn or something, you know. Well, we'll get to that as an analogy. Suppose that everyone is checking each other's power out unconsciously without articulating it to themselves. So we read each other's unconscious power, which eventually becomes conscious and self-consciousness. With lynx eyes, we see through the dark. Now, somebody who has more power naturally and has run with it, is not ashamed of it, doesn't throw sand on the mirror of their consciousness, is going to make the other person jealous or envious. And this is where the term ressentiment, repeat after me, ressentiment, comes in. He thought the French were better psychologists than the Germans. But he also wanted to differentiate it from resentment as such. It became a psychology of ressentiment or resentment. If that person that two people are meeting has more power, the other person will feel inadequate and angry at themselves. They'll have self-contempt. And so they want to punish the other person for making them. They don't at all. They're just there and expressing themselves, making them feel inferior. So what is the best way to revenge this? The cleverest, the slyest, is to make the person feel guilty about having that power. And Nietzsche thought this is the origin of religion. So suppose, let's go back to that previously hinted at analogy. Suppose you're at a party in Brooklyn and someone just has a grace moment. They just say something beautiful and humor, funny maybe, but there's a great insight and poetry to the remark, and it's insightful. And another person who's jealous of that person, or they feel ressentiment, will then say something like, but don't you remember when you were puking and pooping your pants in the alley after you got drunk that one night? And maybe that everyone responds and laughs, ha 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 ha, and forgets that grace moment, that insightful spontaneity. And that's ressentiment in action. And I recommend watching, with Nietzsche, you can follow the power. And I think power is a much better choice than Freud's eros, or the libido, or, by extension, sexuality. Follow the power. Watch it in a family, how it happens at a party, the interaction of two or many people or nations. And that ressentiment, which Nietzsche mercilessly calls, is characteristic of the herd, that is, the many people who feel self-contempt, which they will not admit. And it might go a long way in terms of explaining what is currently happening in the United States and internationally. The herd, the majority of people who feel resentment, they don't really like themselves, will project guilt in one way or another, onto those who are bright, radiant, who have a natural creativity. Most people misinterpret power because they don't have it. And Nietzsche speaks about the noble and the ignoble. The noble, are able to cultivate themselves, refine their radiance, cultivate the arts, be introspective, again, spontaneous. And the ignoble, who misinterpret what power is, see it as like domination in one way or another. I mean, the crudest would be I physically beat you up or kill you or intimidate you in some way physically. And then there are gradations. There's so many, I dare say, but I guess I will, resplendent varieties, multiplicities, and pluralities of all the ways that people want to make other people feel bad about them having power. So let's go back to nihilism and religion. Suppose that all of the values that we had, especially in the West with Christianity and monotheism, were projected onto another world, that there was an eternity, and this could be applied to Plato's idea, theory of the forms as well, the eternal forms. If there's an eternal world and we're transient and mortal, there'll never be any comparison. I could live 9,000 years and it still would be nothing compared to eternity. So what happens is that the actual world that we, in our actual lifetime, however long or short it might be, the significance is siphoned off and projected onto another fictional eternity. So what Nietzsche calls the death of God, he didn't believe in God, so it wasn't a being that died. It's the belief. And what happened in the West is that after 2,000 years, or just before that, Nietzsche wrote in the 19th century, with the growth of science and just the analogy, growing the metaphor, originally the metaphor, going into a cliche, and it self-attenuated. It cut itself off. It vanished, even though no one wanted, or most people did not want to admit it, and they still don't. So the death of God is really the beginning of a interstage, hopefully, called nihilism. That is, okay, you have the worst of both situations. You no longer believe in an eternal life, but you think that you are nothing. So then if you cross the board, the term post-truth appeared 5 years ago from this recording. There is no truth. There is no meaning. And so then, and this is a very fancy term, if we consider what an eschatology is, that is, it's an account of the Alpha and Omega, everything from the beginning to the end, which is applied in the Christian Bible. There's Genesis and then there's the Apocalypse or Revelations. All of the meaning of life was predetermined and supplied to people so they didn't have to invent it for themselves. And then that's gone. So then he predicted, I took a class, and I want to mention his name, Jacques Tammignan of Louvain University, but I was going to Boston College. And the class was called the Nietzsche Prophet of Nihilism. And, the term is not overblown in terms of Nietzsche. He anticipated that with the death of God and nihilism and this vacuum of meaning and truth and needing an explanation, pre-given explanation for everything, that there would be new ideologies that would spring up. And this is how he viewed the rise of communism. If you look at communism, not early Marx, but what became communism as it got interpreted in events by Lenin and Mao and many others, it was an eschatology. It explained everything in terms. In early Marx, there's praxis. There's an interaction between consciousness and material, a kind of mirroring, and then that was wiped clean with communist ideology, and it was all historical materialism and determinism, and everything was explained in terms of class warfare. And this, mirage of communism finally arriving on Earth at some point. But there has to be a dictatorship of the proletariat. It's really the Communist Party beforehand. Look at the rise of Nazism. Everything was explained in terms of race. I mean, how crude is that? But it fit. And then, of course, because it's not true, everybody has to be murdered. And there's genocides. But there is an alternative to that. That is not, it's freedom. If our lives are not predetermined, if we create meaning as we go, kind of an ad lib, and accept that, and accept mortality, then we are free, and we can invent our own lives for us. That is where the will to power comes back. How, in terms of, poiesis, the making at the origin of our unconsciousness, how to remake one's own life. And Nietzsche recommended that we live dangerously, that we can do it out of nothing, and we can be individuals. Later, influenced by Nietzsche heavily, existentialism would look at the anxiety of freedom. Kierkegaard, who wrote just a little bit before Nietzsche, and they didn't know about each other, wrote that anxiety is the dizziness of freedom. So at the origin of our unconsciousness, if there is nothing there, and then we just have to, our poiesis, or our making, our creativity of our own intentionality, of how we pay attention and what we strive for. If, for Nietzsche, we can go into our unconsciousness, kind of, I'm going to be intentionally harsh here, with a soldering iron, and burn out the ressentiment. Find your own envy or jealousy of other people, and overcome it. Then you can overcome yourself, and not live with being dominated by regret and remorse and false guilt. There is a kind of an ontological guilt whereby you are not what Heidegger called throwing yourself into your own most possibilities. You catch yourself doing that. And arguably, a lot of the works of Kafka are really about the passive nihilism of accepting one's guilt over existence. We can self-overcome. Now, self-overcoming, the embodiment of it would be the Übermensch, or the overman, and we should add Überfrau, the overwoman. Ich bin eine Überfrau. So through time, as Heidegger said, we're thrown into the world, into our own most possibilities. And we feel this fundamental anxiety about our freedom. But if we can take it, and we can overcome our ressentiment, our resentment, we can create a great life for ourselves. And that's what's so invigorating about studying Nietzsche. He suggested a thought experiment. Sometimes he speaks about it in his notes, called The Will to Power, or collected as The Will to Power afterwards, after he died. Originally by his sister. We won't go into that. He had a twisted sister, a sister from hell, who sold his archives to the Nazis and invited Hitler to this kind of mausoleum she created around her brother. It's interesting that during his lifetime he sold very poorly, and it was after he went mad, and I don't think there's speculation which I think is irresponsible about Nietzsche's madness, that it was because he went so far you know, in his thinking, and I'll get to the transvaluation of all values quite soon. That his philosophy somehow drove him mad. It was, I think, physiological. It wasn't diagnosed properly. He spent 11 years from age 44 on, more or less catatonic, and yet the empowerment that you feel from Nietzsche's work. Yeah. Oh, just to finish off the story about his sister. Then he started to sell, and you know, I think it was George Brand in Copenhagen gave a speech like, "Wait a minute, let's take a look at this guy and his thoughts," and then it just bloomed. And I'll address the reception of his works and what happened with Nazism soon. But if we go back, we reel back to it, the will to power, scouring out your ressentiment. So you don't have to make anybody else pay for your existence. You don't have to make somebody feel bad about who they are to feel better. Does it ever work, really? Because it doesn't work, you have to keep doing it over and over again. And it's a great explanation for what's wrong with the world, and violence, and armies, and war, as well as the disenfranchisement of intellectuality, or looking for some kind of something that's wrong with somebody else. So misogyny, homophobia, racism. Why does somebody have to pay for your existence? Or why, when you project that somebody is like subhuman or something, or less than you are, look at the hatred there. Look at why. And the psychology of ressentiment and its relation to the will to power really works. I suggest field trips in life for a week or so, following the power in situations and seeing how, you know, you walk into a Walmart, or, you know, they're omniscient here in New York City, is, you know, a pharmacy, and then someone is giving somebody, reproaching somebody else, or kind of, wrist slapping them, you've been naughty. That guilt projection, or the racism, the misogyny, homophobia. It's amazing that so many people want to make other people feel bad. But again, go into your unconsciousness, scour out your ressentiment, your resentment, your envy, your jealousy, your self-contempt. And again, so you don't have to make anybody else pay for your existence, and enjoy inventing your own life. So as we self-overcome, we scour out our ressentiment, affirm that we are mortal, embrace it. Nietzsche thought, well, he had a thought experiment, which I started to, I got, you know, waylaid by another explanation, not really a digression. Suppose that you would live your life over and over again exactly the same way, and could you say yes? He called it the eternal return. And if you can say yes, then you have no regrets. Embrace the difficult experiences of your life. If you overcome them, become a better human being. You become more of an individual. So there is a kind of bitter stoicism that ends up being a light, or again, a radiance. That if you do the thought experiment of the eternal return, and this is why I brought up the will to power in the notes, and then I digressed about his sister. Sometimes he does say that the whole universe, because it's a closed system, will repeat itself. But, and that's why that it's true, literally, that it's better as a poetic experiment, and that's in his non-will to power, the notes really that were collected. That's the way that he argues it, and when he announces it, I think for the first time in the Gay Science. So, amor fati, use the Italian phrase love of fate. Love your own fate. Affirm it. And that is the way to overcome also your ressentiment. And that's the leap over the abyss of nihilism. He said, he calls it the transvaluation of all values. Almost like going to a dentist. Suppose that a dentist has a rubber mallet and they're hitting your teeth to find out where the cavities are. It's primitive, it should be through x-rays, of course. Take a look at what values are. Instead of imagining Moses coming down from Mount Sinai with God etching with lightning, let's say, on a stone tablet, what are the Ten Commandments, the fundamental values that we inherit rather than invent ourselves. Suppose that values begin with a metaphor. And if you think of, just as, simplify or go back to a metaphor is a comparison of one thing and another. And then there's an image that occurs. And when a metaphor is first invented, people see the image. But if the metaphor slowly becomes a cliche and it's used over and over and over again, let's say for 2,000 years in Christianity, you no longer see the image and it no longer inspires. So the transvaluation of all values, we can do it, writ large in terms of the world, but we can also do it with ourselves. What do you really value? And what is going like a rotten tooth? What has become a cliche? And what is not inspiring you anymore? And in terms of self-overcoming, that transvaluation of all values, if you can do the diagnoses, then you can invent new values for yourself. And that also is freedom. So if we go back to the origins of the will to power and ressentiment, the ontology, the first of who we are, if we have the courage to delve into our unconsciousness, we can change who we are and we can reinvent who we are through the eternal return and amor fati, the love of our own fate, no regrets, or battle with your regrets and try to leave them and to invent a new reality for yourselves. We find that Nietzsche is incredibly invigorating and inspiring. And when I read Nietzsche, and when many, or most people who understand his thoughts, we feel more powerful. We feel invigorated, challenged. And he wasn't into somehow blindly or even mostly agreeing with him. He's saying, there's one epigram where he's maintaining, if you want followers, seek zeros. You don't have to believe in him. It's about you. It's about your individuality, your amor fati, your self-overcoming, and your freedom. Thank you very much.